Доброго ранку, ми раді вас
Good morning. We are happy to welcome you in the UCMC. We are starting our working week, and I would like to inform you that today is the World Day of Savings. And the topic of savings, that is what almost every hour is mentioned in Ukrainian media space, and that is the key issue, who to trust money to. We will now have 3 panels of discussions, and we will look at how the relations of financial sector, financial intermediaries and regulator are developing, and those people who are investors, the clients of banks, the clients of all financial intermediaries. We need to understand, if we want to have a developed financial market, then this intermediation should be not just banking, it should be developing via the stock market and international structures. The first session in the morning is related to classical relations of the most massive client. We're talking about B2C, business to customers, the relations between the banking financial business with clients. We know that according to the latest surveys, and the last one was made by sociologists by the Center of Social Monitoring and Ukrainian Institute of Social Studies, named after Yeremenko, together with the Institute of Economics and Forecasting of the Academy of Science of Ukraine. So this survey shows, and that was the end of October, the number of people in Ukraine who do not trust banking system is at the level of 77%. And the same is indicator shows the relations of the trust to the regulator. Why this is happening? Because 8 dozen banks were recognized as not solvent, and people lost their money. And just because there's this fund of guaranteeing deposits which compensates up to 200,000 grivnas for every depositor. But we understand that there is a problem of the mass influence of deposits. About $15 billion and more than 50 billion grivnas flew out of the banking system. The trend has changed. This is not happening when we are asking the citizens. Number of banks got stabilized, and we need to understand that these banks are paying the promised interest. An important step is that in August, the National Bank increased the norm of daily withdrawal of currency from banks. If in the past people wanted to get $3,000-4,000 to withdraw $3,000-4,000 from the bank, the people had to do it during a week. But this now it is easy to withdraw such amount of money. I would like to remind you that I'm Andriy Blinov. I'm economist. And also I'm the radio anchor at Radio Vesti, where you can hear my programs. To the right from me is Dmitro Yablunovsky, senior economist, Center for Economic Studies. I've known Dmitro for a long time, and I know that he has always been analyzing the trust of citizens to banks. And he's looking at whether the citizens are ready to trust their money. To the left of me is Eric Nyman, managing partner of Capital Times Company. I believe I've known Eric as long as I've known Dmitro. Eric has always been giving very correct forecasts, and he always knows what's happening in the society, in the economy. So I will ask some questions. I reminded you of the situation that we have. The question is, who is to be blamed for the fact that the depositors were defeated, so to say. This is the depositors suffered a lot. The responsibility is joint. This is, first of all, the function of the National Bank, and today we'll be discussing what has the National Bank done, what hasn't it done, and what could the National Bank have done differently. That's the responsibility of the banks who, when they were declaring one set of objectives, but in fact it was different. We can name some specific banks and specific names, and the depositors added up to this panic. I don't want to accuse us as depositors, but we need to understand the bigger is the panic in banking sector, the more it affects the situation in the banks. But talking about panic, it's a communication component, and that is also the responsibility of the National Bank. To put it briefly, I believe all the stakeholders are to be blamed, Eric. The key blame is difficult to personify it, but first of all, this is the National Bank, and those who were there in the times of Yanukovych and before Yanukovych and now, the problems have been accumulated, but never the banking system of Ukraine has suffered such a destructive tsunami. So 70%, I believe that the latest leadership of the National Bank is 70% guilty in what has happened. But then we can discuss whether it was possible to avoid it or not. So the main element of our discussion, I will give each one of you up to 10 minutes, no more. So please answer in detail the question whether the National Bank did everything possible to protect the rights of citizens with deposits in banks. And I would like you to talk about positive and negative steps of the National Bank, so that this is a full-fledged economic cost-benefit analysis, the analysis of strengths and weaknesses. So Eric, you are welcome. I have written it on the Facebook. We need to follow the chronology of events. The first mistake was made.
Начиная с, наверное, с конца 2013 года,
Starting from the end of 1913, at the beginning of 1914, and these were the times of Sorkin, where they would where they took about $1 billion somewhere, and this money just disappeared. And we don't see any attempts to return this money. Everyone understood that that was a theft. About $1 billion was taken out of the country, of the bank. That was the revolutionary situation. And the second, after Russia occupied Crimea, the depositors from Donetsk and Lugansk regions also started leaving the banks. They stopped paying loans from these regions, and the depositors went to the bank. And Kubiv was the head of the National Bank. Unfortunately, he did not introduce the prohibition to early withdrawal of deposits. Yatsenyuk was acting governor of the National Bank, and he introduced such a limitation. I've forgotten what year. That was 2004, when we had the first Maidan in the market. During the first month, because of political turbulence, people were taking money from the banks. There was such a precedent. It demonstrated that it was successful, but it hasn't been done again. And the Ukrainian banking system lost about more than $1 billion just because of that. People from Lugansk and Donetsk, they were withdrawing hryvnias and were exchanging them to dollars, and that was the double impact on the banking system. Commercial banks, seeing after the depositors left them, went to the National Bank to get the loans of refinancing, and the National Bank started to issue such loans without any control. Part of that money went to the depositors, but some money went in unknown direction. That was the first wave of devaluation from 8 to 12 hryvnias per dollar. It was possible to avoid it even then. And the main thing is that wouldn't impact so badly on the banking system. Then Gontareva came in autumn of 2014. She came in August, on the 19th of June, but then it took time for her to understand what's happening. It was difficult for her. She started somehow to look for the fair exchange rate of hryvnia. But there were presidential elections. They started maintaining the exchange rate, and almost $11 billion went out of the currency reserves, 5 via Naftogaz, 3 billion to buy Russian gas. Second, it was $1.7 billion for Eurobonds. And the question is, so where $5 or $6 billion of currency reserves went? And the exchange rate was 12 hryvnia per dollar. She threw out the currency reserves. She pumped in the hryvnias into the economy and started looking for the fair course of hryvnia, no limitations. And we understand that the system was taken to poverty, plus the military aggression in Donbass, the direct intervention of Russian troops, and in these conditions to look for the fair course of hryvnia. That means non-professionalism. In the worst case, this is the attempt to earn money. If you bought $5 billion cheap, then you allow the valuation of hryvnia at the peak of 40 hryvnias per dollar at the black market, and then you introduce currency restrictions or limitations, and you stabilize the course, and you get the medal for stabilizing the market. But of course, you earn a lot on what had happened. Now look at the e-declarations. All of them have dollars. These were, they were not risking their grivna deposits or grivna savings. The next one, 2015, the cleaning of banking system. After the banking system was ruined via devaluation, via allowing the depositors to run away. I mean the depositors from Lugansk and Donetsk. And naturally, cleaning of the banking system turned into hunting the witches. There was something to clean, sort of there were bad banks in the market, and now we do have bad banks.
Вопрос, какими методами?
But what should be the methods? There's the classic of management when you need to move the system from point A to point B, but the system is disorganized. In Ukraine, everything that's happening in the system of public administration is disorganized, especially in the end of 14 and the whole of 15. So they took out of the economy, and that means depositors and the turnover capital of business. More than 100 billion hryvnias were taken out. Definitely in personal interest. 1 minute, Eric, is left. Why personal interest? Because then we see what's happening. Instead of you should punish those who are guilty if the banker, the manager, the owner of the bank was stealing money, then you prove it. Then you punish. But why did you punish those who were not guilty? We do not understand. And then what's happening? We don't have practically the procedure of bankruptcy of banks. The banks, together with their assets, were made bankrupt. The bankruptcy of Mikhailovsky Bank shows the problem with the banking supervision. What's happening looks like stealing at the highest level. Thank you.
Дмитро Яблонов.
Dmytro Yablonovsky, you have 10 minutes. So the question is the same, whether the National Bank did everything possible to protect the depositors and the weak and strong weak sides of the regulator. I have several pictures to show. The first chart shows confidence in many social institutions, and trust to the banking system is very low. But analyzing this trust, we should look at other social institutions. We have 10% of population who have confidence in the banks, and the banks are between Ukrainian companies, which has 14.4% trust, and the president, to whom 9 with something percent of population have confidence, but the parliament and some other social institutions have even least trust of population. This slide demonstrates the answer to the question whether National Bank did everything possible to protect population. The National Bank has some other goals than protection of population, the price stability and there is the issue of trade-offs. And here I tried to show them what should be the balance between price stability and banking system stability. We can support banks with refinancing, but this refinancing would later reflect on the market when people would withdraw their deposits and buy something on the market. Also, the next issue, how to balance the short-term and long-term goals in protection of the depositors' interests. Whether the National Bank has to combine two objectives, cleaning up the system, banking system, and also overcoming the crisis in the monetary system. Again, whether we should liberally take so-called vacuum cleaning banks. We have the experience of the banks from 2003, 2004, when we did not resolve finally the issue of such banks which dealt with intragroup funding, etc. The third issue, what should be the policy of NBU towards other categories of Ukrainian citizens who are not numerous, that is, bank owners, lenders, and other people, although they are not numerous. How much we are ready to sacrifice the interests of one group of Ukrainian citizens to the other group of Ukrainian citizens. The next issue is how the National Bank should protect the interests of the depositors, whether it should raise public awareness about the rights of depositors. I found out in result of my summer survey that this work is at low level. Actually, what NBU tries to do to regulate the system, banking system itself, and thus to defend the rights of depositors. But when the interests of depositors are violated directly by the bank, like non-returning of deposit, etc., or extra commissions, they do not interfere. And I think that this function should be built build up. For example, the State Commission on Financial Services has this function that they should defend the users of financial services. The utility services regulate and energy regulator has also this function to defend consumers of utility and energy consumers. And similarly, the NBU needs to have this function about protection of the consumers of bank services. And the last trade-off, which I mentioned on this slide, this is the extent to which deposits to the private banks should be guaranteed by the national bank. And because actually the relations between private depositor, private bank client and the private bank, these are naturally private relations, and the national bank should not be responsible for for the contract between us. It's similar when you borrow money to your neighbor. You can sign a private contract with this person, and the national bank should not guarantee this loan. Andriy mentioned that we have the fund, the deposit guaranteeing fund, but it has to protect the most vulnerable depositors, while I think the big depositors should be aware and have sufficient knowledge about deposits into banks. And the question whether NBU did everything possible to protect the rights of depositors. What possibilities in general does the NBU have to protect depositors, or whether it was ready to perfect storm, whether whether it did everything possible on the account of sacrificing other goals, whether it did everything possible to stop the outflow of deposits. Whether the national bank was able to predict the risks of the current judiciary system, and what scenarios we can imagine as alternative scenarios, and whether they were possible, and what would be the result of them. We have raised the issue of the bank owners. We should discuss it when we speak about savings. We speak about economic strategies, and in this context we mention depositors, we mention regulator, while we should discuss more the beneficiaries, the bank owners. Currently, ordinary people can find any bank owner on the website of NBU, and you can open the NBU website, you can download it, and there you will find full information about beneficiaries of each bank. as of today, the private banks have indebtedness to the national bank at the level of almost 82 billion hryvnia. At least 53 billion are not solvent, won't be paid. And the rest of debt rests over one of the biggest banks in the country. So the question, what should be the policy towards owners of the banks? How whether we could blame them in the distrust to the banking system, and whether we could blame them in this huge indebtedness to the national bank. So about blaming the beneficiaries, there are two groups of the bank owners. There are owners of the banks which are at the stage of liquidation. Maybe they, those who manage to withdraw to some funds, they are in prison. Many of them are in prison now, but those people contributed much to the loss of trust to the banking system. Of course, the crisis also contributed to this drop in trust, but actually mass media and those bad bank owners, they pushed this distrust considerably. The owners of the banks which remain operational, they have opposite interest. They are interested in operational market. They are interested in raising trust of population to the banks. So this is an opposite interest against the previous group. What the National Bank can do and what it should do. The National Bank has a set of functions and we cannot request it to do it more strongly. As I have already shown, there is a set of trade-offs. That is the set of options which and balances which the National Bank could follow. So the National Bank has an option whether to support the problem banks today in order to preserve them, but with the risk to experience bigger pitfall in the with that banks in the future. The national banks, I think, is acting correctly. It tries to cooperate with the bank owners and trying to resolve the issue with this bank in order to find a proper balance. Although people may not like it, whether the owners of banks should be fully responsible for bankruptcy of their banks, and what should be the role of a regulator in bringing banks to responsibility for their actions. I think that the bank owners should carry out this solely fiduciary responsibility, keeping in mind the role of the regulator. The NBU has to monitor banks in operational mode, and if it has any doubts, it should bring the banks in responsibility. The NBU tries to put responsibility for what's going on somebody else, on the depositors, that they have not chosen proper banks, on the bank owners whose banks remained in the East. That's not right. It raises distrust and strengthens distrust to the banking system in general. People understand that NBU is also responsible for bad situation in the banking system. Even BU knows the fact that money are being stolen from the bank. They should raise charges to these owners and bring such bank owners to responsibility. Today we have the International Day of Savings, and our experts mentioned that private clients and legal entities who are bank clients should be aware enough in banking issues, and that's why I would like to ask two questions to our experts now. Who in this country should deal with the public awareness issue in banking area, whether it should be NBU, whether these are private banks, or they should be the state's business, and also about the fund for guaranteeing bank loans, whether we should raise the threshold amount which is guaranteed by the state.
Первое.
Financial awareness. Yeah, sometimes I am mistaken. We need to understand what. Not a single depositor could have all the information about bank where he invests. Any depositor trusts the National Bank. Once the National Bank continues to keep this bank in the market, continues to support all its licenses. For example, the National Bank can introduce some limitations for taking deposits from physical persons. If there are no limitations against this bank, that means that this bank, we are not insiders, we are outsiders. We look at the financial reports. We trust the financial reports, but unfortunately the mass practice in Ukraine shows that you cannot trust financial reports. Financial reports reflect the situation as it was in the past. Very often it is quarterly. Now it's more difficult to get report for a month. In the best case, it's for the quarter. Can we trust it is a big question. Unfortunately, financial awareness. We could be very knowledgeable people, but we need to have objective information. If we don't have this information, we cannot make objective decision. What does the financially knowledgeable person does? He says, keep as far away from Ukrainian banks as possible.
Такие требовать ответа.
Myself, as a journalist, I need to request you to provide an answer who has to work on financial awareness or financial knowledgeability. It's like to trust that the fox will teach chicken how to live. This should be some NGOs, maybe some element of civil society. And to request, we will have to request for technical assistance. And what's your position as to 200,000? Will this return the trust of the depositors? I don't think so. We have two categories of depositors. 90% who... Yes,
Повысить там до миллиона гривен, ну, это может
to increase it to 1 million hryvnias, maybe it will return some part of the depositors. The problem is much more complicated. The first question, who? I believe there should be some self-regulated organization. Maybe the state will be stimulating creation of such organization, but that's in the ideal world. Realistically, the National Bank is the only one who can do it, but this function of the protection should be not just via supervision. There should be some possibility to impose some additional sanctions. But again, my experience showed that there's no consensus as to how this function should look like, but there is a consensus in the understanding that there is no protection of rights. As to the amount, to what extent are we ready to increase the crediting of the fund of guaranteeing the deposits? If we ask the bank, do you want to pay more? I believe they will answer no. I, as a taxpayer, don't want the Ministry of Finance to increase financing of the fund of guaranteeing deposits if we don't have the money to cover the guarantees which we have. Then we cannot increase the amount of guaranteeing. As a moderator, I will react because it was my question. But if we have this perspective to reduce the number of banks from 100 to 50, then there's no sense to do it, because actually we can make a decision to do something to deposits. If we are just talking about trust, then yes, it depends on the objectives. And I will ask another question so that our participants can say some words in conclusion. We discussed two issues: who is to be blamed? And now the question, what is to be done? There was a period when the level of trust to banking system was almost 80%. I remember in 2007 it was 77% that we have today, but today 77 do not trust banks. In 2007, 77% trusted banks. And the question to each one of you, what should be done so that in the nearest 2 years
перспектива, і можна вибудувати стратегію, зробити, аби
what should be done to have the level of trust to banking system not 23% but 50%. Секундочку. This is a very complicated. First, I believe that
треба зробити так, щоб в
we need to do it so that there's more positive than negative in information space. We need to criticize the actions of the National Bank, but it's better to do it like we are doing it today, when we have different positions, but we are not talking about personalities. So first, how to achieve some positive discourse. Second, we cannot foresee it, but there should be no banks, big banks that will be leaving the market, because every big bank that will leave the market, even if it is made ideally, it still has a very big negative impact. And third is how if we teach the depositors how to behave correctly if the bank does something wrong. Well, we need to have the system of forcing to do it. If we enhance the financial awareness by 90%, all the institutions should work accordingly. But the trust was falling. We need to tell depositors how to behave. On the other hand, the National Bank should do everything quickly, taking into account the interests of the depositors. But do we need to return the trust to banking system? Ukrainian economy, without stable and well-working banking system, will be in the situation of stagnation. Ukraine does need the banking system, but if Ukraine needs it, then what banking system? We understand that we don't need it. We don't need the system, such system as we have now. It is sick. We need to continue treat it. But what should be the methods of treating? The key method of treating is legislation. We need new laws on banking system, on currency regulation, and so on and so forth. And the laws are to be executed. It's more than let's do it here and the system will work. This should be part of a systemic reforming of Ukraine. And then we'll have the trust. We need to punish those who are guilty. One of the elements of getting back the trust of British financial system, which suffered from the first financial pyramid they had. It was in the 13th or 14th or 15th century. What they did, even then they had all recordings, and they returned all money to all who suffered because of financial pyramid. They
На мой взгляд, должны быть реестры вкладчиков составлены, все, кто пострадали от вот
So we need to return money to all who suffered. It's worse than what was done when the Sberbank of the Soviet Union got bankrupt. And we need to change approaches to banking supervision. The system should be more transparent. And there should be more opportunities for NGOs to influence the national bank and the banking system. So the time is over. We have 2 more panels dedicated to the topics of financial awareness, to regulation, to relations in the triangle regulator, banks, and clients. If you have very urgent questions now, we can answer them. If not,
Одне питання ми візьмемо. Да.
the question, one question.
Would you please represent yourself? And we have just 1 minute for the answer. Good morning, Andrei, dear colleagues. Happy birthday, by the way. I have a question to Mr. Yablonovsky. I'm Yuri Prozorov, president of the Association of Financial Analysts of Ukraine. So, Mr. Yablonovsky, how do you think whether we can raise the trust from from point 1 to higher one, when many people will have confidence in the banking system? We all know that trust is something that you build up for a long period of time and which you can lose within 1 minute. So the National Bank has to work for a number of years, and the banks have to work for a number of years without failures to be able to restore this trust. During the next panel, when we will discuss crediting of real sector of the economy, we will see that the banks and crediting of real sector is just only one way to develop the growth, the country's economy. So we do not have the other way out. Unfortunately, we cannot ask for the questions from broad public, and on Thursday on Vesti radio station we will have a dialogue with people how to raise awareness among general population and how to raise trust to financial intermediaries. I'm now waiting to have the next panel. With this, I would like to thank to Eric Neumann and Metro Yablonovsky, who agreed to come this early morning to discuss the issues. Thank you, and I invite the panelists